question. The first step is that an application has to be approved by Borough Council. Is that right?
Usually applications are an administrative matter, so they're approved by the borough manager.
By the Borough Manager. Are there ever competing applications? Like two applications for developing the same site?
No, because the only entity that can submit an application is an entity that has an interest in the property.
Oh, who owns the property? Oh, I see. Okay, of course. Thank you.
In the back, yes, ma'am.
I have a question. So, just to clarify, is it correct that, did I hear you say that no matter your recommendations, Borough Council has the last words? Is that correct?
That's correct. We are the legislative elected representatives. Our role is simply to give them advice, which they are free to take or not take. Is there a question over here?
Yes. Excuse me, just to make sure. There is three projects that are approved already.
Do you mean?
The Forest, Windsor and Forest and Haverford and Essex. They've been approved.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
So, why not let them be built and see how it works out before the borough starts tearing other things down and changing other things. See how this all goes once it's complete with the people, the cars, the traffic. Are they renting? Are they filling up? Are the storefronts being rented? If you go up and down Montgomery Avenue in Narberth, they're not. So, wouldn't it be easier to do that before you move another step? First of all, you haven't talked about, nobody talks about how many more police officers we even need, how many more fire engines and firemen. You don't look at that. I say, start with the 3 properties that you got, you're going to start, that you gave for approval to. Let them be done, and wait a month or so and see how it goes, or 2 months.
Let me answer your question. The specific question is, the borough, the entities which determine what happens on a property are the entities that own the property. That's the way things work.
Say that again, please.
What happens on a property, whether or not an application is filed or someone decides to redevelop, tear down, add, that's the property owner decides that. The borough has no control over when someone decides.
Well, they pass it. Isn't the borough the ones that pass it? Yes or no? Didn't you say that in the beginning?
No, I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding on this point.
Fundamental,
It comes out
okay.
all the time. What drives development is not anybody in Borough Hall, it's property owners that drive development. When they say, for example, the owner of the property has decided to sell the building. I'm thinking about Bricklands.
Okay.
Mr. Riddell decided it was time to sell the building because he was ready to retire. No one in Narberth, in fact, we were all aghast
Yes.
that our favorite hardware store was shutting its doors. Nobody here would have voted for that if voting had been an option. But it did fall to us to review and offer an opinion about the building that was proposed to replace Ricklands. At the same time, the Cadence Gym was sold.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing. We had nothing to do with the timing of that sale. That was the market that did that. Mr. Cook died. He's the owner of the properties along Haverford Avenue, as everyone knows.
I know all
No
that.
one here voted for Mr. Cook to die,
I hope
but it
not.
happened. And the result is that we need to pick up the pieces and advise the borough how to respond to the proposed replacement for those buildings, if there is to be one. We don't even know what that's going to look like.
But the borough does have the authority to halt.
No. We do
No,
not.
if I can jump in real fast, so.
Please do, because I can't understand why when you have 3 going to start, and you have businesses downtown, and then you want to start, I know we're not talking about that, so I have to use it as an example.
Yeah,
Okay.
we don't want.
I don't want to
these
talk
things
about that, but I
be
just want to bring.
simultaneous either. I think everyone here recognizes that's going to impose a problem on all of us who live in this town,
Yeah.
particularly the businesses, but it's not something we can control.
So,
no way to put that in the.
That doesn't make
No.
sense.
no, so there's,
That would
so,
be restraint of trade. We can't do that.
You can't play hardball with the developers, though.
We played pretty hardball with the developers, but you can't tell a property owner that he can't develop his property.
Did you give them a parking spot on the street? Do I get a parking spot on the street?
I think.
I know you don't.
Wait,
so I wanted to answer this
Yeah.
woman's
Yeah, I
question.
don't want- I'm not
because
worried about
we had
parking at the
discussed-
moment.
We had discussed that there's a state legislative, a state legislation that dictates planning and zoning in this state. It's called the Municipalities Planning Code, the MPC. Within the MPC, it actually dictates the timeline that is afforded to developers for property development. So, as we mentioned, the borough doesn't vote to have a property owner develop. If a property owner owns a property, they're allowed by law to develop the property in accordance with the borough's
Yes, that I know.
codes. There is
Whenever they
also,
want.
whenever they want. There is also a requirement in the MPC that dictates a good faith process between a municipality and a developer, and it issues, codified in state law, the timeline that you have to follow. And so there is in fact a 30-day and a 90-day timeline that the municipality is required to then give feedback to the developer on these different stages. So when a preliminary plan is submitted, or a tentative sketch plan, the borough is obligated by state law to provide responses within a certain amount of time. Once a preliminary plan is submitted, the borough is obligated to provide a response in a certain amount of time, and similarly, when a final plan is proposed, the borough is obligated by law to respond in a certain amount of time. If not, then that leads to bad things, and that's when people go to court. So, by law, the borough is obligated to respond in a certain amount of time,
What's that
and the
amount of
response,
time? You keep referring to a certain amount of time.
the 30 days or the 90 days. The applicant has the option to agree to an extension of this timeline, which often happens if there are things that we need to work through. So that's essentially saying, in order for the borough to, in good faith, say, yes, your plan has met all of our ordinances, the applicant has to agree to a timeline extension. That is often granted because everyone is operating in good faith, because we want to work through any issues that were identified through the consultant review letters and through the planning process, through the discussions that we have with the planning commission and with the elected officials. So that is what the timeline is, so it does get extended. But as Todd mentioned at the very beginning, we do have like a 6-month process, tends to be about how long it takes to get through these stages, to get through the preliminary plan to the final plan, to get through all of the review letters. For example, once I get a land development plan on my desk, I have 30 days to review it. I'm obligated by law to provide that review within 30 days to the municipality so that the elected officials can then move forward either to ask for an extension or to vote yes on the preliminary plan approval. My letters, I don't approve anything, I make recommendations, it's the governing body that makes the approvals. So those are the timelines that are outlined. So ma'am, to your point, we cannot put a moratorium on development. That is
In a
not
small
possible.
town?
It is not possible.
Just-
There is a case law that supports moratoriums, but
Well, I'll
the,
look into it, but something's not right. But
there's
thank you
case
for
law that
answering me.
supports moratoriums, but the context of development here doesn't warrant that, and the borough would be most likely sued. And now the only thing that we can do is during the final land development process, there could be a discussion between council and the developer to say, recognizing that we have so many developments in close proximity,
Right.
let's work on phasing. But that is good faith discussion between the developer and the borough. There's no legal obligation to have that in writing, essentially.
You
There's-
simply have no control over it.
We have no
I
control over the
understand that.
timeline.
I understand that, but
Sir?
I'd like to start by thanking you folks for your time. I know that I've done a lot of volunteer work, and you guys spend a lot of time with no pay doing this stuff, and we appreciate it. But I would like to say that I imagine you spend a lot of time debating form-based zoning, right? Why does it need revisions?
It doesn't need wholesale revision. It's a complicated concept and it's a complicated document. I'm sure you've looked at it.
I have, and I've looked at it several times and still can't make sense of it.
Okay. Well, we're trying to make it make perfect sense to everybody. We created a document that is profusely illustrated, which the previous one was full of arcane legalese and was almost impossible for anyone to understand, and thereby it was easy pickings for developers for many years. This document is illustrated and bends over backwards to make itself understandable to the average person trying to figure out what they can do with their property or whether their next door neighbor has done something wrong with their property. Sometimes we hear about that. So the more we look at it, the more little things we find in it.
That
The
didn't
big-
do what you wanted to do.
that don't do what we thought we were doing. It's easy to screw up and not realize you're doing
Oh, I
it.
understand that.
I bet there's
You're
no
all
one in this room that wouldn't agree
professionals,
with
right?
that.
Is this your business?
I'm sorry?
You're all professionals, so you're all in like the development
Well,
business?
3 of us are architects.
Yeah, right, so
But-
I would think that you wouldn't need that many revisions.
That's what I thought. But that was several years ago. And we have spent the ensuing couple of years finding things that weren't quite right. And we have, as was mentioned earlier, some of them are things we discovered ourselves, and some of them are things that were pointed out to us by hard experience working on
But that's what
cases.
developers do, don't they?
That's what they do.
They look to exploit the holes in the plan, and the idea is write a plan that's not exploitable.
That's right. So we're constantly working to tighten it up. And there's, sometimes it's language, sometimes it's just a matter of semantics, which we can pretty easily fix. But it takes, a lot of constant effort to do it. Narberth is a very popular place. And it's popular to developers because there's money to be made here by them. So people want to develop real estate in this
They don't live
town.
here.
And we want to keep this town, the character of this town, the way it has been for 125 years. That's what we want to do. Now, I haven't gotten an applause since I was...
That's the direction it's going, I mean, the borough was designed after an English village, and 200 apartments in the middle of
I don't
town.
want to stick
Yeah.
with process questions. The short answer is, in any municipality, this happens. A code is passed and you just find there are things you need. It's just natural. An extra challenge in Narberth is that zoning was invented as a tool that applied to places that weren't built yet. That's when it was invented, that's what it was for. And now we're taking that tool and putting it on a town that's already built. And we run into all kinds of little quirky things. Like we found on the south side, there's a rule that would have forced someone to shave a bay window off their house, which no one wanted this person to shave a bay window off their house. We couldn't have expected that. So we worked with the person to come up with a strategy that saved the bay window on their house. So because we're built, you just find quirky things, and sometimes you don't find them out until someone tries to do something somewhere, and it's not always a rapacious developer. Sometimes it's a good intentioned homeowner who just wants to do, so there's a question about.
Yeah, and this is really a process question, so bear with me. I think you're giving the impression that you have no discretion to apply, you're just following the rules, but I read some of the proposals and from the developers, and they're saying, well, we really need a 3-story building in a 2-story zoning area. We need more than or we don't need a lot or require a number of parking spots because our residents aren't gonna have cars. I mean, these are not within the rules. Who, you know, how do we, the residents, influence whether those additional requests that go beyond the code the way it exists now get implemented? How do we fight back against that if that's what we want to do? I mean, I'm talking process. How do we do that? Is that you? Is that council?
Well, for starters, nobody's been granted extra parking just because they
I
asked.
know, but they have requested it. and we
They're
read
free to
the
request
proposals.
it, and the sky and the moon and the stars and all the rest of it.
Right.
But they have less than one space per car.
The code stipulates what it stipulates.
Which is what?
I'm not gonna
Less than
quote
one
it.
space per car, per unit.
Yes.
Less than one parking space per unit. which
Yeah,
makes
but I'm
no
answering
sense.
this gentleman's
But it-
question.
but
Well, I think
within-
that let's just call space
No,
space.
let's let
That's
me-
what's
Two
going on
things,
here.
Deborah,
Let's
Deborah.
let this gentleman
I would
answer.
like to make
Because
sure.
you're dancing around it.
Deborah?
Everybody's
I
brought that
agree.
up.
No, Deborah,
I'm sorry.
two things. One is, I would like to entertain questions from people who haven't spoken yet. I hope you will
I
respect
haven't
that.
spoken yet. I'm sorry.
And secondly, this is not the time at this moment to debate parking. We're trying to answer, for people who don't come to our meetings, questions about the process. The question is, as I understand
How
it,
do we influence that decision? Because clearly the decision can and sometimes is made to give some allowance to developers beyond.
the allowances, so to speak, that are given within the rules that exist. We haven't, the rules are not changed for this developer or that.
So procedurally, if we're talking procedurally, there's a couple different ways. So if a developer, say, can't meet the zoning requirements, their next course of action is to seek a variance from the zoning hearing board. The zoning hearing board is a quasi-judicial body. You are welcome to attend the zoning hearing board meetings, and public comments are taken at that time. And the zoning hearing board would determine whether or not a variance is granted.
So, but does the planning commission make a recommendation on that matter or not?
To the zoning
Typically,
hearing board, no.
no. Zoning hearing board, like I said, they're quasi-judicial, so they don't take recommendations, usually in the way that planning commission would make recommendations to borough council, for example. Now, the other option is that if the developer is seeking something, if they can't meet the standards of the subdivision and land development ordinance, then they would seek a waiver. Waivers are discussed with the planning commission. The planning commission makes recommendations on the waiver requests to borough council. Borough council
So
then gives
It's important
those.
that you have a sense of the citizens' feelings on these matters.
Absolutely. So that is where we discuss the waiver requests with the applicant at public meetings with the planning commission. And then borough council also discusses those waivers at public meetings, at council meetings, and it's borough council who will then vote to either grant those waivers or not. And so that is how a developer is able to get relief from some standards of either the zoning or the saldo that they may not be able to meet, and those are decided by.
I think that's a great concern here in the room, and it's good to know a little bit more about it. Thank you.